A teenager is missing. A police investigation exposes the deaths of dozens of boys and young men. All are traced to a single killer. A photographer turns to rape and torture, meticulously documenting his crimes on film and audio tape. In a quiet suburb, 4 people are found dead. Police wonder about the kind of madman who could commit this crime. For serial killers, one death is just the beginning. Obsessed, they strike again and again, learning more with each crime, improving, perfecting. They're confident they'll never be stopped. But the mind hunters work tirelessly for their capture. It's just after 6 o'clock on January 23, 1978, in California, when Sacramento County Police arrive at the home of Terry and David Wallen. They are called there by a neighbor at David's frantic request. 22-year-old Terry Wallen has been brutally murdered. The house shows signs of an intense struggle between Wallen and her killer. She has been shot and her body slashed. A large knife wound runs the length of her torso. Some of her internal organs have been removed. Investigators are horrified by the viciousness of the crime. The scene becomes more gruesome when they find evidence that suggests the killer might have consumed Wallen's blood. Officers find a yogurt cup with bloody lip prints around the rim. Sacramento police don't know what to make of the scene, but they know who can help them. They call on a specialist, a man who's familiar with horrific and bizarre murder cases. His name is Russ Vorpagel. He is a special agent with the FBI. The brutality of the slaying makes Vorpagel fear that the murderer couldn't control himself and that Terry Wallen's death may be just the beginning of his rampage.
There's just no need to disembowel a victim. There's no need to reach inside and cut out body parts. There's no need to cut a 4-inch piece of major artery and take it along with you. I mean, hey, we knew we had a nut and we were worried and we knew that something's going to happen.
Vorpagel called a colleague at the FBI. Robert Ressler has tracked and caught some of the world's most dangerous killers. As a criminal profiler for the FBI, he stakes out the darkest corners of a killer's mind. In the 1970s, he was one of the first to use the term serial killer to describe those who murder again and again. Robert Ressler is a mind hunter. Ressler struggles to understand the killer's mind by studying the crime scene. Knowing how the killer thinks is essential to predicting his next move. When will he strike? Who will he target?
You have to have an emotional need to solve a crime. You have to want to know who the offender was. You have to know what that person is, what he's like, what he was like before, during, and after the crime.
But there is a danger in identifying too closely with those who destroy. Ressler heeds the words of German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote that whoever fights monsters should not become a monster himself, and that when one looks into an abyss, the unblinking abyss stares directly back. For Robert Ressler, Nietzsche's observation is motivation and warning.
Looking into the abyss to me means looking into the depth, the deep crevices, the dark crevices of man's human mind. And when it says the abyss looks back, to me that means I'm looking back at myself. I'm seeing my reflection. Because in every horrible killer, yourself is in there somewhere in part. Somewhere in your life you could have gone that same road.
In the 1970s, Ressler was among the original members of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the first FBI program to systematically research a killer's motivations. Ressler interviewed some of America's most notorious murderers in prison to learn about their habits and attitudes. Today, Ressler is a private consultant who works all over the world to help solve serial murders. In January of 1978, Ressler applied his knowledge to help Sacramento County investigators devise a psychological profile of Terry Wallen's murderer. It was the first step in tracking the killer. Ressler began his profile by examining the crime scene details.
What you look for at a crime scene is the positioning of the body, the way the body was left by the killer. You look at the state of the body from the standpoint of being clothed or unclothed, and of course you're looking for available weaponry, or did the killer take a weapon to the scene, use it, and take it away. These are all things that you really start sizing up in your head.
After Terry Wallen was shot, the killer cut her body with knives taken from her own kitchen. Then he left them in plain sight at the scene, a detail that would prove instructive for Ressler. Because the greatest number of serial killers are male, at the time, Vorpagel and Ressler conclude their suspect is a man. They also assume he's white, like the majority of American serial killers. The brutality of the crime and the killer's apparent disregard for leaving evidence behind convince the pair their subject is mentally ill. That helps them pinpoint the killer's age. Ressler knows that mental illness usually begins in adolescence. It would take at least 8 years for the killer to grow sick enough to perform the acts of violence he inflicted on Terry Wallen. Assuming symptoms began at age 15, Ressler figures the killer would be in his mid to late 20s. Any older, and he would have already committed several gruesome homicides. Ressler goes further. He believes the killer to be schizophrenic, a mental illness characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and bizarre behavior.
Get out of here!
The heinous nature of the crime points to full-blown psychosis, a total loss of contact with reality. Because he drinks the blood of his victims, investigators call him the vampire killer. From his office in Virginia, Ressler works feverishly with Vorpagel in Sacramento to refine the killer's profile. What would he look like? They are convinced police should look for someone thin. Male schizophrenics generally eat poorly when they eat at all. And Russ Vorpagel believes the murderer will pay little attention to his appearance.
A guy that is suffering from a major mental illness is probably going to have a deterioration in his hygiene. Probably doesn't cut his hair, wears the same clothes for weeks at a time, doesn't brush his teeth, is scroungy looking.
Given his bizarre behavior, the killer would likely live alone. Vorpagel delivers a copy of the profile to the Sacramento police to circulate throughout the county. But no strong suspect emerges. the vampire killer remains at large. Will the profilers find him before he kills again?
Sir?
3 days after Terry Wallen's brutal murder in 1978, less than a mile away from her house, the vampire killer strikes again. Police find the bodies of Daniel Meredith, Evelyn Miroff, and her son Jason. Missing and presumed dead is Miroff's 22-month-old nephew, Michael Ferriera. These new deaths convince Ressler and Vorpagel that unless this murderer is found quickly, he will strike again. The mind hunters redouble their efforts. Using information gathered from this crime scene, they refine their original profile. Again, the vampire killer shot his victims. Again, he used knives taken from the victim's kitchen. Two knives are found in the room, and another was found outside. He doesn't seem to care that he's left the weapons behind. These details tell profilers that the killer is not planning his crimes. Although he brings a gun, he cuts the bodies with weapons he finds at the scene and then leaves them there.
We have a knife that was used to mutilate the bodies. It was taken from the kitchen, used on the victim, and then discarded at the crime scene. Seeing this for a second time definitely reinforced in my mind that we were dealing with a highly disorganized killer.
Organized and disorganized. These words describe a serial killer's behavior before, during, and after a murder. Organized serial killers carefully plot their moves. They cover their trail so thoroughly that little or no evidence remains to tie them to their crimes. By contrast, disorganized serial killers act on impulse. Their behavior is random, making their next move difficult to predict. Investigators find bloodstains in the bathtub. Profilers believe the vampire killer may have bathed in a mixture of water and blood. The crimes are becoming more gruesome and the killer more deranged and more disorganized.
Now, we know darn well that your normal, everyday person is not going to fill a tub with water and bathe in the blood. So here we see personality. Here we see mental illness. We see mental deterioration.
From the evidence at the crime scene, Vorpagel and Ressler reconstruct the grisly sequence of events. And the terrifying portrait of a man they've never seen begins to emerge. The evidence reinforces the mind hunter's belief that the vampire killer's appearance will continue to deteriorate. He likely won't have changed his clothes. Unless he is single and living alone, the killer can't possibly escape notice. Their subject is a thin, disheveled loner, not more than 30 years old. Investigators are puzzled when murder victim Daniel Meredith's stolen red station wagon turns up a short distance away. Because it was found nearby, Ressler determines the vampire killer must have walked to the crime scene and then fled on foot after abandoning the car.
The killer would be residing within a very close distance to that abandoned car. I said approximately 1/4 mile.
The day after the Miroth murders, police receive an unrelated report that a dog has been shot and mutilated within blocks of the crime scene. For the mind hunters, it's the break they've been looking for. They know that as children, serial killers often mutilate or kill animals.
And he would go out and kill these pets, shooting them with the same gun he shot Wallen and Miroth and Meredith. Same gun, he'd shoot these pets. And then he'd gut them and drink their blood.
As more animals are found dead, the circle closes. The mind hunters are convinced that the vampire killer lives near the slaughtered animals and his human victims. He won't have traveled far. Police circulate the revised profile throughout the city in hopes that someone may have seen a disheveled or strange-acting man. Officers concentrate on a quarter-mile radius of the murders. As a woman in her late 20s is leaving a Sacramento shopping center, a strange man approaches her. Hearing of the vampire killer murders, the woman contacts police. The man she eluded at the shopping center, she tells officers, is a former high school classmate, Richard Trenton Chase. She was shocked by his appearance. He had bloodstains on his sweatshirt. His eyes seemed sunk into their sockets. A yellowed crust was around his mouth. According to the woman's description, Chase fits the profile of the vampire killer. Armed with a search warrant, officers enter Chase's home. They're unprepared for what they find. Nazi paraphernalia dominates the small apartment. The place is littered with pamphlets about alien conspiracies. The chaos in the living room fits the profile of someone with an equally chaotic mind. In the kitchen, police find appliances spattered with blood, as well as newspaper articles about the murder of Terry Wallen. Several dishes in the refrigerator contain human tissue. In a kitchen drawer are knives taken from Wallen's home. Investigators also find a toolbox and blood-stained rubber boots. Chase is arrested and charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, including the killing of Evelyn Miroth's nephew, 22-month-old Michael Ferriera, whose remains are found not far from Chase's apartment. The jury deliberates only a few hours before pronouncing Chase guilty on all counts. The sentence? Death in the electric chair. In 1979, Robert Ressler decided to talk to Chase in prison.
The reason I interviewed him, very frankly, was to validate, to do an update and validate the profiling work that I had done, to talk to him directly after working on the case, after seeing the crime scenes, after reading the police reports, and of course the court records. It's a way you really fine-tune your profiling.
Chase tells Ressler that he had killed only to preserve his own life. He needed blood, Chase says, to survive what he called soap dish poisoning. Chase believed that a gooey residue under his soap dish proved he was dying. He claimed his blood was drying out and corroding his body. His killings, Chase contended, were made in self-defense.
When he got down to the motivation, he said that the blood in his veins, the blood throughout his entire body, was turning to powder or dust, and that it was moving very slowly through his body, causing him to slow down, causing him to be fatigued and become very ill. And he felt this was being done, of course, he said, by the influence of the unidentified flying objects and the aliens. And he said that the only way he could counter this was to get a fresh supply of human blood.
What drives a man like Chase to murder? One FBI study of 36 serial killers revealed that although most began life in two-parent homes, by age 2, almost half the boys' fathers had abandoned their families. Nearly half of the surveyed offenders reported cold or uncaring relationships with their mothers. 26 reported such relationships with their fathers. Nearly 70% of the families had histories of alcohol abuse. 1/3 had histories of drug abuse. Almost all reported some form of childhood psychological, physical, or sexual abuse. As children, many serial killers tortured animals. The majority did not graduate from high school. While the men had the required intelligence to perform skilled jobs, most had poor work histories. Only 20%, or 6 offenders, had ever managed to hold on to steady work. Yet, to all appearances, serial killers seem normal, like your neighbor or your friend.
Most of these people are like everyday people. They oftentimes are intelligent, they're attractive, they're good conversationalists. IQ's usually up about, at least high normal or beyond, and they're very deceptive.
Ressler was opposed to the death sentence for Chase. Chase, he argued, was mentally ill and should have been locked up for life in a prison hospital. Prison psychiatrists eventually agreed. Chase's sentence was commuted to life in the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. But Chase killed himself in his prison cell just after Christmas, 1980. He had stockpiled his antidepressant pills and then taken them all at once. Richard Trenton Chase's brief and chaotic reign of terror had come to an end. In contrast, one of America's most cunning serial killers was also one of the most organized. Highly intelligent and a talented photographer, this murderer specialized in kidnapping, rape, and torture. Police called him the unidentified subject, or unsub. He was a master of planning. He used film and audio tape to record his crimes. In a rented storage shed, he stockpiled pictures of his victims and recordings of their anguished cries. He was so meticulous that he would leave virtually no evidence of his atrocities, except for the photographs he took himself. Unsub customized his cars to resemble unmarked police cars. He added heavy-duty suspensions and strong restraints so that once inside, his victims had virtually no chance of escape. For 5 years, he traveled from state to state, never staying in one place too long. He was self-reliant, financing his crimes of kidnapping, rape, and torture with yet another crime. He was a skilled counterfeiter. He was confident that he would never be caught. In Manassas, Virginia, a team of former FBI agents pursue some of the world's most dangerous criminals. They call themselves the Academy Group. Between them, they have amassed years of experience investigating serial killings. Robert Hazelwood and Peter Smerick are experts in psychological profiling of criminals.
If you in life are an impulsive person, you act without thinking, well then that crime scene may be very, very sloppy and be a reflection of your impulsive acts. On the other hand, if in life you're a cold, calculating individual, you don't take any unnecessary risks, well, that type of behavior can also be demonstrated at a crime scene.
Even with crime scene evidence, categorizing serial killers is difficult. Some serial killers demonstrate a mixture of disorganized and organized habits.
All too often, If an investigator starts looking at a crime scene and tries to put the offender into one of these nice, neat little categories, he's going to be disappointed when the person he arrests doesn't fit these categories in all areas.
In the seaside resort of Ocean City, Maryland, a young woman has just finished her shift at a convenience store. It is Memorial Day weekend, 1979. She is approached by a man who identifies himself as a police officer. He shows her his identification and is driving an unmarked police car. He tells the woman she is a suspect in a series of robberies, and he insists that she accompany him to police headquarters for questioning. He handcuffs her and pushes her into the car. It's the beginning of the longest and most terrifying experience of the woman's life. The man is no police officer. He is unsub. And she's his latest victim. He takes her to a deserted building where he repeatedly rapes and tortures her. He photographs and tape records the ordeal.
I think one of the buzzwords today that we use is power and control. And whether you're dealing with a rapist, whether you're dealing with a serial killer, I think it still comes down to those two basic elements: power and control over the life of another individual.
Eventually, he will push the dazed woman back into his car and take her for one last ride.
He stops the automobile, opens up the passenger door, and rolls the woman out into a ditch. But he did not kill her. He allowed this victim to live. And as a result, within a number of hours when daylight came, she was found, she was rescued, and now became a full-fledged FBI investigation for kidnapping.
The FBI set up a massive manhunt for unsub. The Ocean City woman was the latest in a long list of his victims. Some were tortured, others murdered. But many years passed before there was a break in the case. At the same time the FBI searched for unsub, the Secret Service was on the trail of an elusive counterfeiter, a man who routinely passed fake $20 bills to unsuspecting store clerks at malls and shops in the Midwest and on the East Coast.
The one thing about any law enforcement agency, no matter how good we are, you need an element of luck, and you need the cooperation of an alert citizenry. In this instance, an alert clerk recognized a composite sketch as a customer who was currently in the store. She notified mall security notified local authorities, and within a short period of time, the suspect was apprehended.
The man police arrest is James Mitchell DeBartoleben. The Secret Service soon discovers that DeBartoleben is not just a counterfeiter. Secret Service agents search a storage unit rented by DeBartoleben. Inside are sheaves of the fake currency he's been passing. But to their shock, agents also discover a grotesque treasure trove of pictures and audio tape. The 1983 discovery unmasks the focus of the FBI investigation. Robert Hazelwood, then an FBI special agent who had written a criminal profile of unsub, reviewed the materials seized from DeBartoleben's storage unit. Agents find thousands of photographs of DeBartoleben's victims. Among them are photos and audio tape of the woman abducted in Ocean City in 1979. Some of the photos date back to the early 1960s. They find the tools of a killer's trade. Victims' clothing, 10 guns, phony police identification, journals, blood-stained lingerie, and jewelry. 7 license plates allowed DeBartoleben to roam with little fear of his car being traced. The FBI also found handwritten notes. They contained codes that referred to past and future crimes. Although they have uncovered DeBartoleben's cache of damning images and sounds, agents have a problem. The killer's face remains literally out of the frame of the pictures he's taken with the victims. Investigators will have to prove DeBartoleben is the man in the photographs if they are to tie him conclusively to the rapes and deaths. During his FBI career, Peter Smerek was a forensic photography expert. The Secret Service sent him a number of DeBartoleben's photos to analyze. Several show a naked torso and uncovered arms. Smerek focuses his attention on the arms. They have a distinctive pattern of small moles and freckles. Smerek asks the Secret Service to temporarily remove DeBartoleben from his prison cell in order to photograph him in the same position as the person in the confiscated photos. The gambit pays off. When Smerek compares the photographs taken by the Secret Service to the ones found in the storage unit, he finds the patterns of freckles match. It's the proof agents desperately seek.
In all the years that I've worked as a criminal profiler, I can't think of another case where the offender was such an excellent photographer that unknowingly he took his own crime scene photographs, which ended up putting him in prison.
In 1984, DeBartoleben was tried and convicted. Today, he is in a federal penitentiary in Texas, sentenced to multiple life terms.
DeBartoleben was one of the most dangerous criminals that ever walked the face of the earth, in my opinion. He was able to commit a number of crimes over a number of years in a variety of states and never have those crimes linked to him. That made him extremely dangerous. I think he's involved in a lot more crimes than we're aware of, yes.
By controlling every variable, weapons, location, and victim, the organized serial killer can slip through any dragnet, getting away with murder for years as he hides in plain sight. Such was the case of John Wayne Gacy, a prominent Chicago area businessman. Well-liked and respected, Gacy camouflaged a terrible secret. In 1978, in Des Plaines, Illinois, 15-year-old Robert Piest was reported missing. Having learned that Gacy was preparing a remodeling bid for a drugstore where Piest worked, Chief Detective Joseph Kozenzak of the Des Plaines Police Department goes to Gacy's home. Gacy denies knowing Piest. But investigators are suspicious. A background check reveals Gacy was once convicted of the sexual abuse of a teenage boy. Kozenzak places Gacy under surveillance. Initially cooperative with the police, Gacy becomes increasingly surly as Kozenzak's investigation continues.
He had a real mean look in his eyes. You could feel that there was hatred there. And that he really didn't care what we were investigating and was more concerned about trying to stay out of the way.
Gacy threatens a lawsuit if police continue their surveillance. Officers persist, suspecting that Gacy has much to hide. But even they are not prepared for what they'll find. For several weeks in 1978, Des Plaines police didn't let John Wayne Gacy out of their sight. Finally, it came time to search his house. The search uncovers a photo receipt that belonged to Robert Piest, linking Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A more thorough search would reveal even more. Chief Detective Kozenzak was the first to enter Gacy's home.
I was one of the first people that arrived at the house and went in through the back door, walked in. The whole place was just dark and kind of eerie. All the window blinds had been closed. And there was some sense of, I don't know, it was kind of ominous actually, because we were starting to believe that there could be people buried underneath Gacy's house based on the information we had gathered.
Police interviewed Gacy's ex-wife, friends, and former employees. Stories came out that Gacy propositioned his workers for sexual favors, that some had disappeared, and that his house had a strange odor. One of his workers suggests they checked the crawl space. After rigorous questioning, Gacy admits to detectives that 4 years earlier, in 1974, he killed one of his homosexual partners. Gacy claims the murder was in self-defense. He hid the man's body beneath the floor. Then, Gacy shocks investigators. He confesses that he murdered almost 36 young men and boys, also hiding many of their bodies under the floor. The confessions trigger an intense search for the missing men. Detectives examine the crawl space in the hope of finding Gacy's victims. They uncover 3 decomposing bodies and parts of other bodies. But the police don't stop with the crawl space. Knowing more bodies must be stashed under the house, they cut away the floor to find them. Eventually, they would find bodies buried under the dining room and garage floor. Under the house is a virtual killing field of buried bones and jumbled skeletons. Police arrest Gacy for the murder of Robert Piest, though the bodies they uncovered were dead too long to be the missing boy.
Gacy, he figured that the best way not to get caught for his crimes was to keep control of his victims after death. But when you're a psychopath, a sexual psychopath, he figured nobody would ever find those bodies down there because he was too smart, smarter than police, smarter than everybody.
By stashing his victims in his own home, Gacy maintained total control over them, even in death, and could remain confident that no one would ever find them without his knowledge. Such careful attention to detail, from planning to death, is the mark of a highly organized killer.
Everything about the case, especially when viewing the home inside, would indicate that Gacy was highly methodical, very well planned, and that he had thought these crimes out in great detail prior to embarking upon them.
Gacy also dumped his victims in the Des Plaines River. Police recovered 6 more bodies there. One of them was Robert Piest. When it was over, police identified the remains of 33 people.
Bob was very interested in this process because the FBI was formulating within their behavioral science unit kind of an in-depth study of people who commit a series of killings and wanting to know more about them, wanting to understand them, and this was a classic case.
The goal of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit is to map the mind of the serial killer.
So many people believe that it's the sexual act itself that he's performing with the victim that is of primary importance to him. In reality, it's the entire game that's important to them. The selection process, the surveillance, knowing that I have selected you to become my victim and you don't know it. And then all of the planning that goes into the stages of actually conducting the abduction. And so they are rehearsing this and living this maybe for weeks or months before the actual abduction occurs. And to a certain extent, the sexual activity afterwards may almost be an aftermath.
That's gotta hurt.
With each killing, Gacy refined his methods, learned from his mistakes, and improved on his successes. He carefully lured his victims into a well-designed trap, distracting them with weightlifting, plying them with alcohol, and showing pornographic movies.
Bring it down to your chest, all the way down. Okay, can you bring it up? Can you lift it up?
He eventually grew so confident that he brazenly targeted a boy from his own neighborhood. Many victims came to Gacy's home hoping to get a job with his contracting firm. He'd meet with them in his garage.
But it feels so good.
The soundproof garage was designed by Gacy and constructed by his company.
Excellent. Good job, you okay? Yeah, you probably feel it right here, don't you?
A motorized door was the only way in or out.
Here's something I haven't shown you.
If his victim didn't object, Gacy would demonstrate a magic trick using trick handcuffs.
Like this. Sound real good, right? Okay. Ready?
After showing how the handcuffs work, Gacy would persuade his victim to try them.
Ready? All right. Now, you did it the easy way, hard way.
Then he would challenge him to attempt the trick behind his back. If the victim agreed, the trap was sprung. Gacy would switch the trick handcuffs for real ones.
On. This one like this. There you go. Okay. Now, twist.
Once immobilized, the victim was at Gacy's mercy.
It's not working. Hey, come on, man.
1, 2, 3. Try to twist it.
Man, it's not
Only
coming off.
Gacy knows exactly what happened
Oh, you have to
next.
relax. Come on, Bobby, relax. Okay.
Like serial rapist and killer James Mitchell DeBartoleben, Gacy thought he had completely covered his tracks. But mementos found during the search of Gacy's home provided key evidence, though police didn't know it at the time. Detectives discovered driver's licenses, belt buckles, rings, and other personal effects. Ressler alerted investigators to the importance of these objects.
We had actually found these items not fully realizing what we had found till after Bob came in and started pointing out to us that to you a belt buckle is not important, but to the person who committed the crime, it's very important. It's a visual process to help relive the crime at any given time that he wants to do so.
The souvenirs are a reminder of his past murders and an inspiration to kill again.
To Gacy, this is some sort of a symbol of his success, a reminder. It enhances his fantasy and carries him on to the next victim. Trophies, I call them, for the serial killer, where they kind of enhances their fantasy to have these objects around.
The most disturbing object found in Gacy's house was a map indicating job sites around the United States where he had worked as a contractor. Ressler believes it's likely that Gacy wouldn't have confined his killings to Chicago.
And it only seemed logical that if Gacy's traveling, doing this in Chicago, he's doing it elsewhere as well. That's why I firmly believe that John Gacy killed more than the 33 he was convicted of. I think probably maybe twice that number.
Forensic teams dismantled Gacy's house. In all, they recovered 27 bodies there. How many more Gacy killed, police would never know. For 10 years, starting in 1979, Ressler interviewed Gacy in prison. Ressler was surprised to learn that he had grown up 4 blocks from the killer in suburban Chicago. Gacy even remembered delivering groceries to the Ressler family, recalling in detail the distinctive flower pots that Ressler's mother used. Gacy also had darker recollections. He described for Ressler a turbulent relationship with his father. Ressler wasn't surprised. Nearly all the serial killers he knows of tell similar stories.
And it's all documented. I ran away from home, as you know, when I was 19 years old because I couldn't get along with my father. I mean, he was just overbearing. I was dumb and stupid, never would amount to anything, and so I just took off and said, to hell with it. I was gone for 3 months. Well, it's more likely.
From prison, Gacy made a painting and sent it to Ressler.
What is amazing is now...
It depicted Gacy dressed in a clown costume.
When I got into clown makeup, I regressed into childhood. It was fun being a clown because you could be yourself or just let yourself go and act a fool. You know how people, if you're a businessman, you've got to keep a certain rapport and stuff like that, and everybody looks for you for an image. But as a clown with the makeup on, you could be slapstick and funny and have a good time. That's why I always enjoyed clowning.
In Gacy's painting, he stands in a grove of evergreen trees, surrounded by balloons. The inscription on the back reads, "You cannot hope to enjoy the harvest without first laboring in the fields." Gacy refused to explain the painting's meaning to Ressler or to anyone else. Ressler believes the painting hints at many more murders Gacy committed.
He said, you can get away with a lot of things when you're behaving as a clown because people see you as something funny, they see you as something as amusing, they don't know what's beneath the grease paint, they don't know what's beneath the cloth. He said clowns can get away with murder.
John Wayne Gacy died by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Since the early years of criminal profiling in the 1970s, other serial murderers have been identified and caught. Such names as Son of Sam, Ted Bundy, and Jeffrey Dahmer have become known to mind hunters and to a public alternately fascinated and repelled by their crimes.
Serial killers are driven by control, by dominance, by discipline, by authority. They have very warped concepts of interaction with another human being. They don't look at another human being as a human being, they look at them as an object.
Robert Ressler believes that serial killing, while not limited to the United States, has intensified in this country since the end of World War II. Part of the reason has to do with a culture that glamorizes and encourages violence.
Culture produces violent crime. I would say 75% of the world's serial killers are American products. Yeah, it sounds very strange, but it's one of our, it's like America, it's like a baseball, apple pie mom and serial homicide. It's unfortunate, and it's certainly tragic in a sense, but it's one thing in the world of criminology. The United States is absolutely broken all records.
Profilers must take care that the poisonous thoughts of those they track don't pollute their own. For one who stares into the abyss, there is a danger of falling in. Ressler says that mind hunters must work their way back from the brink every day of their lives.
I've maintained a balance, I think, consciously, by isolating myself from the horror of what I see. I go to work at 8, I quit at 5, I go back to a normal life, I have a drink, I watch the news, I cut the grass. I've kept a perspective. I've kept in tune with the mainstream and the normal people of society.
For Ressler, profiling is less about drama than about analysis. Observe, think, conclude, and realize there are no easy or quick answers.
The movie concepts is that the profiler will solve the case, everybody can fold up their tents and go home. Profiling is one tool in the overall toolbox of the investigator. It gives him one more dimension, one more piece of that puzzle. And when you put it all together, sometimes it's very effective.
Profilers explore the mind's darkest regions, dragging what's hidden into the light of day. Only then can it be examined and learned from.
The value of profiling, as in this case of Richard Chase, is to give the police some concept, some psychological portrait or an image of the logical type of subject that they're looking for, to give them a clear picture, because otherwise it's just an empty room.
These human monsters feel they can never be caught, that they are invulnerable. Yet, with each new victim, each drop of blood, each fiber or DNA strand left at the scene of a crime, the mind hunters probe deeper into the killer's mind. Perhaps the day will come when profilers won't be needed. But for now, the mind hunters will have to continue looking into the abyss. A scientist tries to establish when a murder occurred. His only clues are insects collected from the body. Forensic investigators puzzle over a partial skeleton found in a forest. They have two pieces of evidence to work with, a skull and a wasp's nest. In a trash-filled house, detectives find 3 people dead. 2 of the victims are mummified. To solve the bizarre case, investigators rely on dead beetles. Insects may be the only witnesses to a crime, but bugs tell no tales. Or do they? To solve a murder, investigators often must unravel a tangled web of clues. Sun-kissed Hawaii is a vacationer's dream. Sand, surf, and balmy temperatures lure tourists by the thousands. But life in paradise can have a seamier side. In late December 1989, a search team scoured the forest near a small town on the island of Oahu. They were looking for clues in the disappearance of 32-year-old Roxanne Tandall. Family members were concerned because Roxanne hadn't shown up for work and no one had heard from her in days. Detectives Andrew Glushenko, Joe Self, and Rufus Kaukani received the call that she was missing. Relatives told police this wasn't Roxanne's normal behavior. If she was safe, she would have come home or called. They feared something terrible had happened. They were afraid Roxanne may have been killed. Neighbors believed that she had a violent quarrel with estranged husband Benjamin shortly before she disappeared. The couple were about to be divorced, with Roxanne gaining custody of their 2 sons. Neighbors heard loud noises and several thumps coming from Tandal's house. Suspicion quickly fell on Benjamin Tandal. Although Benjamin had appeared in person to report Roxanne's disappearance, Detective Kaukani thought Tandal's subsequent behavior was odd.
What was kind of suspicious about the report that was made by the husband at the Kahuku police station is that the officer asked for an identification, a photograph of her, so they could, pass it around. Instead of taking a photograph and taking it back to the station, he picked up clothes and he went to Wailua, which is probably another 20 miles, 15 miles away, to wash clothes. And that's kind of not indicative of somebody who's caring and concerned about a missing person.
All right, Dave.
Suspicious that foul play might be involved, police obtained a warrant and searched Roxanne's home. If Roxanne was alive, perhaps they could find some clues to help locate her.
Kitchen or the bathroom, Dave.
If Benjamin had kidnapped or killed her, they needed evidence to prove it. Investigators brought with them a Luma light, a device that makes blood and fingerprints visible. The operator's goggles cut through the glare of the bright blue light so he can pick out clues that would otherwise go unnoticed. The light revealed a fine mist of blood droplets on Roxanne's ironing board and in her bedroom.
See? Those smears? Yeah. Just like we thought.
The search for a missing person suddenly became a murder investigation.
Anytime you have a surface with some blood on it and you hit it with a heavy force, it's going to fly out and spatter. And the harder that you hit it, the more force that you use, the finer that the spatter will be.
Where was Roxanne Tandal's body? Prosecutors needed it to build a strong case. Without it, her killer would likely go free. Detectives raced against time. In Hawaii's tropical heat and humidity, corpses decay rapidly. Telltale clues can be lost. Evidence tying Roxanne's death to her killer could disappear entirely. A major break in the case came on New Year's Eve, 1989, 2 weeks after Roxanne's disappearance.
Hey guys, I think I found something over here!
Searchers found the body of a human female. She had been wrapped in 2 blankets, both tied securely by fabric strips. Marks on the body suggested she was strangled and hit forcefully on the head.
We found our victim. She's about a quarter of a mile south.
Although her face was blackened and her body swollen, family members recognized the remains as Roxanne's.
It's going to be about 5:30.
When investigators opened the blankets, flies emerged.
Examiner and our forensics team to our location. All right, guys.
The next morning, detectives called University of Hawaii entomologist Lee Goff, one of the most respected insect scientists in the United States.
How are you, Dr. Goff? Detective Glushenko. This is Detective Rufus Kaukani. He's a
Hi,
lead
Doc.
investigator.
Like it or not, insects are mankind's constant companions, thriving alongside us throughout our lives and well afterward. As a forensic consultant, Goff turns the abundance of insects to his advantage. His specialty is using bugs as a kind of biological stopwatch. If detectives hoped to tie this murder to Benjamin Tandal or to anyone else, they needed to get some answers from the bugs.
Give them a chance to come back in and start feeling comfortable. Okay.
Goff would act as their interpreter.
Really, when you're dealing with insects, you're looking at the largest group of animals that are on the face of the earth, the largest single group. A conservative estimate, very conservative, would give you 750,000 described species, and in reality, I think it's probably much closer to 1 million.
Insects compete with us for food and shelter. At death, we may actually become their food and shelter. That's what Goff counts on. When he arrived at the crime scene, Goff was careful to collect all the insects he could. He snared flying bugs in a net. Others he picked off the body with tweezers. Goff would use the flies to pinpoint when the victim was killed. Because insects live, grow, and die in predictable intervals, their life cycles can be precisely timed out, sometimes down to the hour.
And in order to figure out the actual time of death, you have to have as complete a collection as possible of all of the insects that you find on the body. And for each of those insects, then you have to know when they occur on the body and what the duration of their life cycle is. If you're working in the early stages of decomposition, say within the first 2 weeks, what you're really interested in are individual species of flies.
In Hawaii's sultry climate, insects thrived on the victim's remains, providing Goff with ample specimens to work with.
You look for the most mature specimens that are there, but you try and get a general sampling of everything that's on the body, either on wrappings, clothing, or actually on the surface. Then, as the body is removed, you want to look at what's crawling around on the soil underneath the body, because very frequently, especially as decomposition progresses, you find that the center of arthropod activity shifts from the body itself to the kind of interface between the body and the soil. So you'll have a lot of things present there that are very significant in your estimation that aren't going to actually be on the body.
Goff studied the samples at his lab at the University of Hawaii. After the female fly lays her eggs on a dead body, larvae soon develop. They're commonly called maggots. They secrete enzymes and spread bacteria, which enable them to consume human tissue. Goff believed that the maggots would tell the tale of the Tandal murder. But would they speak clearly enough to bring a murderer to justice? The life cycle of a fly is closely tied to our own. When a life ends, it's the beginning of a new generation of flies. A dead body is an invaluable source of food for hungry maggots. Flies begin to arrive moments after the host's death. Some unknown chemical from human remains attracts them from up to 2 miles away. As soon as they arrive, the females lay their eggs in protected areas, natural body openings, wounds, and folds of skin.
Generally here in Hawaii, the species we deal with, you're looking about 12 to 18 hours between the time the egg is laid and the egg hatches. Then you have your maggot. The maggots then congregate, and they feed together, they form this mass, and they're going to move through the body together. So in any given mass, because not everybody lays their eggs at the same time, you may have maggots of several different species and quite frequently different age classes.
As they mature, maggots pass through 5 stages that entomologists call instars. From infant to adult takes several days to several weeks, depending on species and environmental conditions. Figure out what species is invading a body at a crime scene, observe the particular stage of its development, and you can trace an insect's short life back to the time of death of its human host. Lee Goff did just that to determine precisely when the victim was murdered. Armed with that information, police could check the alibis of any suspects.
The initial analysis showed about 10.5 days of insect activity. I knew it was longer than that. I knew there was a fair amount of literature that would back that up.
Goff suspected the tightly wrapped blankets may have delayed the fly's arrival by several days. He realized he would have to fashion an experiment to simulate the same conditions under which the victim's body was discovered. To determine when the victim was killed, Goff relied on a staple of biological research, a dead pig.
But to try and pin it down, what I actually did was get a 50-pound pig and duplicate the wrappings and place the animal out in a somewhat similar situation, and then determine how long it took for the insects to actually go down and get to the point where they could oviposit on the pig.
Goff unwrapped the pig periodically to check for signs of fly eggs. Nearly all of the insects collected from the victim's body were either maggots, adolescent, or adult flies. Although decomposed, it wasn't out long enough to attract many other insect species.
After the first couple of weeks, you start running out of flies. And then we have to go into what we call succession. And this works the idea that any insect that feeds on the body is going to change it. And by changing the body, then it makes it attractive to another group of insects. And their feeding makes it attractive to yet another group, and so on down the line.
During succession, entomologists expect to see a more or less orderly transition from one insect species to another as the bugs arrive at a corpse and begin feeding. Depending on the weather, the numbers and types of insects vary. Goff altered the amount of sun, shade, and water on the pig to mimic what may have happened to the victim's corpse. But how long did it take for the first egg-laying flies to arrive? Goff didn't need to wait long for an answer. He observed the first flies on the pig carcass 2.5 days after it was left in the open, wrapped and bound. Goff added the time observed during the pig experiment to his initial time of death estimate of 10.5 days. He was convinced the victim was murdered no fewer than 13 days before her body was discovered on December 31st. Those extra 2.5 days made all the difference. Goff's estimate dovetailed almost exactly with the date of the victim's disappearance and the discovery of her body 2 weeks later on New Year's Eve. Neighbors told investigators they last saw her in the late afternoon of December 17th. She was sitting stiffly in the passenger seat of Benjamin Tandal's pickup truck. Brought in by police for questioning, Benjamin agreed to take a lie detector test. He failed. Then he asked for an attorney. Officers charged Benjamin Tandal with the murder of his wife. As they prepared for trial, the prosecution's case was bolstered by additional evidence. Detectives discovered that one of the blankets used to wrap the victim's body matched a photo of a blanket on a sofa in her home. And the bloodstains found in her house during the police search matched her blood type. Benjamin Tandal was tried and convicted for the murder of Roxanne Tandal. On November 24, 1989, he was sentenced to life in prison. By establishing the timetable for the murder, Goff turned scattered clues into hard evidence.
Whatever Dr. Goff did helped the case a lot, especially during trial. You have a victim, a female victim, who's missing for 2 weeks. Her husband is giving a story that she had left to go out to a party, to work, and then afterwards she might have gone out with some friends. You run into the possibility that maybe she was killed a week before the body was found as opposed to 2 weeks. So I think during the trial, Dr. Goff's testimony supported a lot of the circumstantial evidence that we had against the defendant as far as when she was killed.
The bugs had spoken, and their wordless testimony allowed a committed team of investigators to bring a killer to justice. Elsewhere, thousands of miles away in the Tennessee mountains, insects helped identify a missing person. A young man on a walk stumbles upon bones that were picked clean. Nearby, a weathered skull held the clue that would help investigators make sense of the jumbled remains. Eastern Tennessee, nestled in the foothills of the Cumberland Mountains, is famous for its fresh air and small-town charm. But the rural location also makes it an ideal place to dispose of murder victims. In January 1989, police received a call that a man had discovered a leaf-covered human skeleton. Aside from some bits of tattered cloth and pieces of jewelry, little was left to indicate that this was once a living, breathing person. Police found no identification of any kind, no hints of who the victim might have been. They found no evidence of trauma, yet they suspected foul play. How else would the bones have gotten there? Detectives found little to tell them what happened, except for a dried-out wasp's nest, long abandoned by its maker. Would it be enough of a clue? For help with the case, officers of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation contacted forensic anthropologist William Bass. Bass is an expert at reading human remains. He first established the age and sex of the victim. From the shape and size of the bones, he concluded that the skeleton belonged to a female who was not yet 18 when she died. But the cause of her death remained a mystery.
There were no gunshots in the skull. There were no damage to any of the long bones or the bones of the body. We did not recover the hyoid bone, which is a bone in the neck, and which is one that you get when you usually break if you strangle somebody.
Although investigators were eager to find out how the girl died, they first tried to determine when she died, in the hopes that it might lead to her identity.
Boy lives right over here in this house. Where is he now? He went on home.
In the summer, the soft tissue on the body in Tennessee will disappear very rapidly. You can go from what you and I are now to a complete skeleton in only about 2 weeks in July and August in Tennessee. If you die in the winter, it takes longer. But if you die in the winter, by the following spring or summer, the brain would have decayed and the cranial vault, which is the inside of the skull, cranial vault would be dry by that time.
At the crime scene, Bass looked at the wasp's nest. Knowing when it was made would help them pinpoint the victim's time of death. Wasps need a dry place to build their nests. Bass surmised the skull must have been on the ground for several months before it dried enough to become a suitable home for the insects.
So what this tells me is, in January, when this skull was found, with a wasp nest in it, that individual had been dead and the skull dried the previous summer, because this is when this wasp nest at least was built.
To confirm his findings, Bass contacted forensic entomologist Neil Haskell to help him identify the victim. Haskell consults in criminal investigations all over the U.S. Like all insects, wasps live, breed, and die in predictable patterns. In Tennessee, they begin nest building in late April or May. By summer, the nest bustles with activity. Then, when the colder weather comes, the wasps die back. The cycle starts over again the following spring.
Knowing this life cycle of this particular group of wasps enabled us to come up with a minimum time of the year that it took the wasps to build, plus another 6 to 8 months for the skull to become cleaned and dry.
In order for the queen wasp to have made her home there, the skull must have been completely dried out by spring 1988. Prior to the wasp's arrival, a brigade of egg-laying flies and carrion beetles must have foraged on the body and cleaned the skull late in the summer of 1987. Both Bass and Haskell concluded that the young girl died no later than midsummer 1987.
We coupled the developmental time of the wasp plus the normal insects that eat this carrion and came up with an estimate of at least a year and a half prior to finding this the skeletal remains that the person probably died. Now that was a minimum time. It could have been a little longer. In reality, it turned out that the body had actually been out there since February of 2 years prior to the time we found the remains.
The wasp nest had given investigators the information they desperately sought. Once they knew how long the girl had been dead, they began their hunt for her identity. They narrowed their search to teenage girls reported missing in 1987. They also took note of the jewelry found near the body. Investigators pulled a report detailing the disappearance of a young girl. In a photograph attached to the report, she wore some of the same jewelry found at the crime scene. The girl's name was Michelle Denise Anderson. She was 15 years old when she disappeared. Denise was last seen at a party on January 9th, 1987. When she didn't come home the next day, her mother reported her missing. Until police knew more about her disappearance, they considered Denise a runaway. Investigators had solved only part of the mystery. They knew Denise's name, and because of her age and the condition of the bones, that she was healthy when she died. They are convinced Denise was murdered, but they still don't know how. And no one has ever been charged with her murder. The case remains open. The investigation continues. The stories that bugs tell can fill in the missing pieces of a death investigation. For detectives in an Indianapolis suburb, insects would provide the only leads to 3 bizarre and puzzling deaths. Counted in the trillions, insects vastly outnumber any other creatures on Earth. Florida tropical biologist James Kastner has been studying bugs for 25 years, and the field is definitely growing.
Well, approximately 10 years ago, the estimate of total insect species in the world was maybe 2 to 3 million. More recently, there's been work done in the rainforest with fogging the treetops in a canopy, and this has now raised the estimate of total world insect species to 30 to 40 million.
Insects usually go unnoticed or are shunned altogether. They're maligned for spreading infection, destroying crops, and otherwise making life miserable. But without carnivorous insects and their appetites, The carcasses of dead animals would remain where they fell until bacteria consumed them. Not everyone finds bugs distasteful. Studying insects and other so-called lower life forms is nothing new. It's just becoming more widely practiced and providing better information. Forensic entomologist Jason Bird believes insects have a lot to teach us.
Forensic entomology has been around since 13th century China. It's been used extensively in Europe and Australia, and apparently it's pretty slow to catch on in the United States. It's really only had its current widespread use since the 1950s, and just within the past 10 years alone, it has enjoyed a resurgence of popularity.
Despite its obvious benefit to criminal investigation, forensic entomology is not a field of study sought out as enthusiastically as medicine or law. The ranks of forensic entomologists are slim. At most, a few dozen insect specialists in the United States regularly assist with murder cases. People see bugs not as partners, but as pests.
Unfortunately, most people treat insects as something creepy and something to recoil and be afraid from. And most of this is a cultural prejudice or just not understanding what insects are all about. I think anybody who takes the time to study insects and to learn how they live, learn the extremely interesting behaviors that they show, can't help but become interested in them, if not enamored with them.
The benefits can be many to those detectives willing to overcome their distaste for bugs. Insects can make or break an investigation. That's the message brought on this day by insect scientist Neil Haskell, who has come to Wilmington, North Carolina. His mission is simple: to introduce law enforcement to the exotic world of bugs and their ability to crack difficult cases.
The ultimate goal is to acquaint the law enforcement folks, the crime scene investigators, and coroners, medical examiners with first of all, the importance of using entomological evidence in death investigations. Second of all, to train those investigators how to collect, recognize and collect the proper specimens, and then how to preserve it and how to ship it and transfer it to a qualified forensic entomologist for evaluation analysis.
Although insects can't communicate in a conventional sense, their behavior on a dead body can speak volumes to those who know how to listen. Haskell uses dead pigs as stand-ins for dead humans when teaching police officers and evidence technicians the finer points of forensic entomology. In his training sessions, Haskell tries to simulate the real world as best he can. He arranges the pigs as one might find a dead human, covered by brush, hidden out of sight.
These pigs have been put out to attract the carrion insects that are forever present in most of our environments. And it has been successful because we do know that under these carcasses we're going to be finding some fly larvae that have infested the carcasses. And this is what we would find on human remains that have been out for a period of time.
Haskell's class is no place for the squeamish, but the things his pupils see here are no worse than what they're likely to find in a real murder investigation. It's time for their next lesson: collecting maggots.
We're collecting some of the maggots as preserved specimens. We're also collecting some of the maggots as live specimens. We had the liver that we're going to be growing them on in what we call maggot motels. And today we're using liver, beef liver, and we put 15 or 20, 25 maggots in that, and then close it up, place it in this can or container, and then allow them to grow, monitor them daily or every 2 days to see how they're doing. And then, then we can, eventually they'll grow to adults, and then we can make positive identification of those specimens.
Female flies are the insect's first strike on a corpse. If something dies, they'll find it. When a female arrives on decomposing remains, she goes into an egg-laying frenzy.
The maggots are the result of the attraction of the chemical smells that are coming from the body that attract the adult flies in. Now the flies have developed and evolved over centuries to select out this specific, very specific kind of food, the rotting tissues of dead animals.
Yeah, we don't want to
motel ready too? Yeah.
Not all the fly offspring will survive, but the mother has given her ravenous young a fighting chance by choosing a ready source of sustenance.
Get it this way. We got to come around from the other side.
This female will deposit anywhere from 150 to maybe up to 400 eggs in a clutch, seeking out sites of protection such as the nose, nasal area, mouth, and eyes. Those eggs will then go through a period of time when they will eventually hatch, a few hours to a day or two depending on temperature.
The eggs will hatch into first-stage larvae, which will grow and develop for a few more hours and then shed their skin and go through several more changes. As maggots grow, so do their appetites. During their first 2 stages, they never stop eating. The individual maggots form a large mass that eats and moves as one.
And while they're in this maggot mass configuration, temperatures within this mass will climb very, very high, 15, even up to 20 degrees centigrade above the normal outside air temperature or ambient temperature.
Back in the lab, Haskell examines the mass of maggots. The particular stage and rate of growth of the larvae will provide investigators with a good idea of how long a body has been left in the open. The maggots act as filters. They can be tested for chemicals and drugs they may have picked up from their host. For those of us who know how to listen, insects can be vocal witnesses to the circumstances of a person's death. In November 1987, residents of a middle-class Indianapolis suburb phoned police. They were worried that they hadn't seen their elderly male neighbor for a number of days. He lived there with his invalid sister and aunt. Police arrived at the house. When no one answered, they entered. The house was a complete mess. Investigators found refuse of all sorts in the kitchen: unwashed dishes, uneaten meals, discarded silverware, and empty packages. Bags of decaying food moldered in the garage. Then police found the homeowner, collapsed on the living room floor, apparently dead for some time. Not certain what they were facing, investigators called for backup. As more detectives arrived, neighbors began to congregate. Nearly every inch of the house was covered with trash. Police wondered what kind of person could live like this. The officers cautiously inspected every room. The search quickly took a bizarre twist.
What a mess, gosh. Oh, yeah?
Investigators were shocked to find the mummified remains of 2 women in a pair of back bedrooms. Since the cause of death wasn't readily apparent, police assumed murder. Sergeant Reggie Roney recalls the grisly discovery.
We're treating this as a homicide scene because we don't know what has happened here. And my first view of the body is there's no body. All that's left is clothing, and it's kind of like a mummy laying there on the bed. And I look at it and I can see the little skull caps that the older women used to wear, and bed sheets. And I can tell all the bodily fluids have gone seeped through the mattress, and it's just a skeletal type mummy.
The only evidence seemed to be an abundance of bugs, beetles mostly, found on the bodies of both women. Whatever happened here wasn't an ordinary death scene. It would take extraordinary means to sort it all out. Investigators on the scene of the triple deaths faced a double mystery. How did the victims die, and how long had they been dead? Autopsies would probably answer the first question, but the second one seemed unsolvable. At the crime scene, detectives meticulously cataloged each piece of evidence, including several dead flies and the dried husks shed by beetles, called cast skins. Each insect type was a valuable clue, but investigators weren't certain how to read the evidence. They also gathered samples of an unusual brown, stringy material found near both bodies. Baffled by what they found, they realized they needed the help of a forensic entomologist. They called on Neil Haskell. He met members of the Indiana University Medical Center Forensic Science team at the morgue for an autopsy.
Obviously, we had to determine how long these individuals had been there, because in the investigation it was important to pinpoint time of death. Obviously, who these individuals are, when they died, and possibly where they died and how they died. And so each one of the different forensic disciplines was providing pieces of that puzzle together. Right there. Okay.
For Haskell, that meant identifying the particular insect species that colonized each of the women's remains.
Thank you. And
Haskell noted a curious difference between the two female mummies. One's face contained most of the original flesh, while the second did not. From the second body, Haskell collected numerous empty puparia, or casings. These, he knew, were left behind by juvenile blowflies as they hatched into adulthood. But the first set of mummified remains was marked only by dead beetles. Why the difference? Haskell knew that decomposing remains almost immediately attract egg-laying female flies. Judging from the amount of flesh still on the body of one of the mummies, flies seem to have ignored it altogether. Insects are weather dependent. Their development is controlled by the seasons. Haskell suspected that weather had played a role. To gather more evidence, he visited the house where the bodies were discovered. In both bedrooms, he found beetle cast skins. But in one bedroom was an abundance of intact, dead beetles. In that room, he collected specimens of 3 different species.
the blinds had been pulled down. They were down, but behind those blinds, as I raised the blinds and searched the room, there were a couple hundred adult dried beetles that had come from the body and had tried to reach the out of doors and gone to the windows and could get no further. And so then they died on the windowsills.
Haskell was still puzzled by the pencil shaving-like substance found next to the dead beetles on the woman's body. At first, he theorized it was a kind of fungus. Then he remembered that a similar material had been found on a body in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1962. In his laboratory, Haskell put the substance under a microscope. As others had in the Copenhagen case, he identified the substance as beetle feces, excreted by the larvae. The feces is associated with remains that have been mummified for long periods. As detectives continued their search of the home, they found a diary written by the aunt. In her last entry, dated October 5th, 1977, the aunt reported that her health was failing, and so was the health of her niece. Neither, the aunt wrote, had long to live. This information helped Haskell with his investigation. He theorized that the aunt, whose remains were more skeletonized than her niece's, must have died when the flies were still active. That would have been no later than autumn. The ant's body had less flesh because the flies arrived during warmer weather, laid their eggs, and their larvae had cleaned the skeleton. Haskell concluded that the aunt, the older of the pair, died first in October 1977. The niece likely would have died in late December 1977, or perhaps early January 1978. The niece's body was better preserved because her death came in the coldest part of the year. There simply were no egg-laying flies around to be attracted to the chemical signals emanating from her remains.
They got up and moved in the middle of the night.
The mystery of when the women died was solved. Other questions persisted. Why were the women kept in the house for 10 years after they died? Police could only speculate on the details of their lives. The diary helped fill in some of the missing pieces. The aunt had fallen in the backyard and broken her hip. She could no longer get around. Soon after the aunt was injured, her niece also broke her hip. The man looked after both women around the clock as their health continued to fail. After his aunt died, the man decided to keep her in the house rather than alert anyone to her passing. Shortly after, his sister died. He decided to keep her death a secret as well. He managed to maintain the charade for 10 years. To avoid being discovered, he always ordered enough groceries for 3 people. He refused to allow the delivery person to bring them into the house for fear the smell would be noticed. He insisted that the bags be slipped under the garage door. That explained the sacks of uneaten food rotting in the garage. As the weather warmed, the odors from the bodies surely would have been difficult to live with. To the neighbors, the man was friendly enough, but he kept them at arm's length. When asked about the health of his aunt or sister, he'd be non-committal. Sometimes he'd complain that the women were keeping him up all night, or give details of their failing health. Remarkably, the neighbors kept their distance and never set foot in his home. As detectives investigated further, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. They discovered that the man received at least $140,000 in fraudulent Social Security checks after the women's deaths. But that may have only been part of the reason. Perhaps the decision to keep the bodies was motivated more by compassion than greed.
He had cared for them so long and you know, looked at them 24 hours on a daily basis. I think that he just probably couldn't bring himself to give up his loved ones.
no charges were ever filed in the case of the Indianapolis mummies. The trio's deaths were officially recorded as due to natural causes. Before they died, they named their church as the beneficiary of the estate. The Social Security money owed to the government was partially paid back by the sale of the property. The bugs had helped detectives solve the curious case of the Indianapolis mummies. However unusual, it was one investigation among hundreds for insect specialists like Neil Haskell. Haskell says that bugs are becoming powerful allies in an age when sophisticated technology is figuring more and more into criminal cases. One example is the analysis of human DNA found in the blood that bugs take from human bodies.
The mosquito feed and it swells up. Its abdomen swells. That's a human blood meal in there. And you can analyze that blood meal for human DNA. And it works in mosquitoes, bed bugs, fleas, and lice now. Tremendous tool.
The study of insects is the study of the great tenacity and variety of life. Yet modern science has much to learn about insect life, especially as it applies to investigating death. According to entomologist Lee Goff, many details are still unknown.
We need to put forensic entomology on a firmer statistical basis. Right now, the statistical basis is just beginning to be developed, and we need to see more modeling in terms of what's going on with the corpses. So there's an awful lot of research. I think probably I've got more questions now than I had when I got into it 15 years ago.
As methods improve, as more scientists enter the field and learn more about insect behavior, the value of forensic entomology will grow.
Now, when we first started, actually, I'd go back to 15 years ago when I first became involved in forensic entomology. Law enforcement agencies thought we were a little bit nuts and really were a little skeptical that we'd be able to give them anything that would be of use. Over the past 15 years, by working very diligently with different agencies and different groups of people, we've been able to convince them that, in fact, it is a very powerful tool for use in their investigation. So I'd say now it's very widely accepted.
No matter how technical our world becomes, the simplest methods are sometimes the best. And sometimes the least likely sources are the most dependable. Slowly, homicide investigators are beginning to realize the invaluable contributions made by the smallest witnesses to murder. A mother's search for her daughter spans 2 decades. She no longer knows what her child looks like. Will digital technology help locate her? A man slays his family and vanishes without a trace for 18 years. Can the work of a sculptor flush him out of hiding? 2 hunters stumble across human remains. Can an artist put flesh on the bones and give the victim a name? Forensic artists combine science, intuition, and skill to build likenesses of the murdered and the missing. Their work can reunite families or help solve a murder, creating faces of hope and faces of tragedy. Under a gray Texas sky in the winter of 1994, 2 hunters trespassed on private land outside of Lubbock. But their offense would pale in comparison to what they'd discover that day in remote Yellow House Canyon. They stumbled onto the partial remains of a human skeleton and a white, high-heeled shoe lying nearby. Though alarmed by their discovery, they knew if they called the police, they'd be fined for poaching. The hunters decided to leave the bones for someone else to find. But when they told a friend what they'd seen, he called the sheriff. The hunters agreed to take Deputy Tom Watson of the Lubbock County Sheriff's Department to the site of their find. Watson immediately suspected the remains belonged to a murder victim, dumped in the canyon to conceal the crime. Only the skull and a few bones remained. Over time, animals must have dragged away parts of the body. Watson directed his deputies to tape off a wide area to be searched for more evidence. Once the crime scene had been documented on film, he called in the county pathologist to examine the bones. The pathologist collected the bones and took them back to his lab, where they could be examined for signs of trauma.
I don't believe we have any local people missing.
He confirmed Watson's suspicions. The victim was murdered. The upper part of the skeleton bore multiple stab marks, enough to kill a person several times over. The case was now officially a homicide. Watson returned to the canyon the next day to sweep for more evidence. To capture the killer, he first had to name the victim. But his search uncovered no form of identification. The only clothing was the one shoe. To identify his victim, he desperately needed more to go on.
The first thing we have to do is determine whether it's male, female, and approximate age. Check those statistics against any possible missing persons that we might have locally. If we don't find anything there, then we expand the search out statewide into New Mexico and Oklahoma. And then if we still haven't got her identified, then we go national with it.
The search team recovered more bones and, luckily, almost all of the victim's teeth, but nothing more. No personal effects that could clue them in to who the victim was or when the killing occurred. Watson turned the bones over to a forensic pathologist who was able to narrow down the possibilities. He concluded that the victim was a white female, 18 to 24 years old. The weathering on the bones suggested she'd been dead at least 2 years. Tooth fillings in the lower jaw and a crown in the upper jaw offered more identifying features. The teeth were x-rayed so they could be compared to dental charts of missing white females of the same age. Using the x-rays, Watson began a search to make a match. He chased dozens of leads, some from as far as New Jersey, but none matched the dental records of the woman found in Yellow House Canyon. His investigation was leading nowhere. Meanwhile, a killer remained free. Watson needed more than the victim's bones and teeth to identify her. He needed to give the woman a face. For that, he turned to one of America's leading experts on facial reconstruction. Karen Taylor has worked for the Texas Department of Public Safety in Austin for 16 years. As a forensic artist, she helps identify skeletons by recreating what the person looked like when alive. Her images are distributed by police and the media in the hopes that the remains will be identified. Using techniques she's developed over the years, Taylor has had remarkable success. She serves police jurisdictions throughout Texas and works on cases across the country. Her job keeps her extremely busy. The unidentified woman from Yellow House Canyon was one among many nameless persons awaiting a face.
Deputy Tom Watson from the Lubbock County Sheriff's Office brought me the skull of an unidentified white female found in that area, and he asked that I try to build a face on that skull to help him identify her. And the information was provided to me that had been developed by an anthropologist to examine the skeleton. And so I knew from Tom's reports that the person I was going to be drawing was a young white female. I unfortunately didn't have a lot of other information. There was no clothing, for instance. Clothing is a very good clue as to body weight for me from skeletal remains. There was also no hair, which provides a added complication, especially in a case of a female. So because there was so little to work with, the case was a little more difficult than some of them are.
Without the victim's clothing to use as a guideline, Taylor had to take her cues from the skull alone. When putting a face on a human skull, one of the most critical parts is determining how thick the flesh will be. Taylor relies on standard tables of measurements developed by forensic anthropologists and classified by sex and race. Based on these measurements, she cuts out rubber markers that match the average depth of the skin. She glues them onto the skull at 21 anthropological landmarks, like the cheeks and chin. When the markers are in place, photographs of the skull are taken. For Taylor to accurately draw the face, the photographs must be exactly life-size and not distorted at all. After placing transparent paper over the photograph, she uses the rubber markers as guides in drawing the facial contours. It's the first step in recreating the image that may lead to the identity of the victim. Taylor also relies on scientific formulas to draw in the eyes, nose, and other features. The average human eyeball is between 24 and 25 millimeters in diameter. Since this is also the size of a U.S. quarter, Taylor has a convenient tool for tracing in each eye.
I also know from reading some ophthalmology texts that the average person has an iris diameter, an iris width really, that is between 11 and 13 millimeters. And I have little red lines on this scale showing the average range. So, and I've checked it on a number of people, and it seems to hold true for most everyone. Most everyone's iris will fall right in that range.
Taylor relies on her knowledge of anatomy to draw in the eyelids. On many people, the orbit, or eye socket, has a raised piece of bone on its outer edge. The inner edge of the socket has another bony landmark. These are the points of attachment for the ligament that stretches across the eyeball and controls the movement of the eyelid.
Our upper lids are curved slightly more than the lower lids. They tend to drop slightly over the top of the iris when looking at a person in life.
Taylor next draws the victim's nose, relying on some rules of thumb and hints provided by the skull.
Surprisingly, we do have some pretty good information about noses to help predict the look of a nose in life based on the bony clues.
Because the victim was a white female, Taylor knows to add 5 millimeters to each side of the nasal opening. That represents the width of the nose. If the victim were African American, Taylor would add 8 millimeters to each side. A bony spine at the base suggests how far the nose projects.
Because that little bit of bone tells me whether to tip the nose down or to tip it up or whether it's rather level. And so I'm looking at the profile to determine that angulation of the nasal spine, and that gives me a hint. In this case, this is quite an upturned nasal spine, so I want a tip of a nose that's up. She's a young girl. She's got a youthful little nose. And the nasal spine tells me it's turned up at the tip.
When the mouth is relaxed, the lips tend to cover the 6 front teeth. When we smile, we flash as many as 10 teeth. Taylor draws the unidentified woman's mouth in a relaxed expression to give her a neutral appearance.
So if I make a mark at the outside of those canines, that should give me an approximation of the width of the mouth. If you can see the staining of the gum line at the edge of the enamel of the teeth, gives us a ballpark idea of the vertical dimension for the lips. And again, I know that she's young, I know that she's white, so I'm thinking young white female as I draw this little mouth.
From a faceless skull, Taylor will soon create the image of a woman. She hopes it will give a name to the victim and eventually name the killer. As Karen Taylor added the finishing touches to her portrait of the unidentified woman, the victim's face was reborn. The image was now ready for prime time. Taylor's drawing was shown on television and local newspapers, giving anyone who recognized the woman the opportunity to provide information about her. For Sheriff's Deputy Tom Watson, the broadcast was a defining moment in the case.
This particular case was very frustrating for the first 6 months because we were not able to identify her. We were about to the end of all of our options as far as getting her identified until we did have the forensic drawing made. And once we aired that on the media, within a week we had 2 callers gave us the name of the dead girl.
The callers identified Taylor's drawing as Belinda K. Tillery, who'd been missing for 2 years. One of the callers was Tillery's mother, who had lost touch with her daughter. The face on the screen delivered an eerie shock of recognition. Now, with a name to go with the face, Taylor obtained a copy of Belinda Tillery's driver's license photograph. She compared it to her drawing to study the similarities that led to Tillery's identification. The resemblance was undeniable.
She has narrow or rather close-set eyes, and yet very broad face, broad cheeks. And this small nose, and the width of the nose proportionately is very close here. The mouth size is almost exactly right, and the fact that there's a very wide chin favorably compares also.
For closer identification, Taylor superimposed the photograph of Belinda Tillery onto the victim's skull.
As I was able to get the facial image on top of the skull and start to compare it, I had a couple of difficulties by this method. One being that her face is slightly turned in her driver's license photo, therefore I can't quite get the nose position correctly. However, when I put the eyes pretty much centered in the orbits, I see that she does have the facial width that my drawing shows and that I could see in this skull. So I could see that it's a pretty favorable comparison, and we probably should go ahead with finding dental records on this person if possible to make a more positive comparison.
A positive identification couldn't be made until X-rays of the victim's teeth were compared with dental records of Belinda Tillery. Dr. David Duell, a forensic dentist with the Texas Department of Public Safety, made the comparison. He found the bone structure to be the same. Teeth with fillings matched. Both X-rays showed a root canal on the same tooth, and a temporary crown was identical on each film. Dr. Duell declared it a match. Taylor's work had identified the victim. It was now up to Deputy Watson to track down the killer. He started by interviewing Belinda Tillery's friends and neighbors. Watson learned that Tillery had had an abusive boyfriend named Troy Armstrong. It was rumored that he'd become angry when she told him she was pregnant with someone else's child. Watson obtained a photograph of Armstrong and went looking for him. He tracked him to Roswell, New Mexico. There, he searched the town. He questioned the locals, digging for any lead he could find. But Armstrong was gone. He'd found out that he was a suspect in Belinda's murder. Back in Lubbock, as Watson gathered more information, a picture of Belinda's last days became clearer. It had been 2 years since anyone had seen her. That's when some folks heard she'd gone camping with Armstrong. He liked to camp in Yellow House Canyon. It was a remote place that he knew well.
What's going on up front, all right? I'll catch up with you, okay? All right, well, come on.
People mentioned that he carried a large hunting knife almost everywhere he went. The pieces were fitting together. It seemed that a bitter Armstrong had planned to take Belinda to this remote canyon and get rid of her for good. He thought no one would find her remains. After Belinda's death, he told a girlfriend he had nightmares about stabbing someone in the back. Based on the evidence, Watson obtained a warrant for Troy Armstrong's arrest, but he still had no information on his whereabouts. More than a year later, in January 1996, Watson received a tip. He found out that Armstrong was on the road with a truck driver buddy who was hauling for a company in California. Watson quickly contacted the trucking company. He discovered that their trucks were equipped with a global positioning system called GPS. A transponder on each truck bounced a signal off a satellite, telling the company where it was at all times. They informed him that the truck he was looking for was now traveling through Nebraska. Within minutes, Watson got the Nebraska State Police on the other line and asked them to set up a roadblock. They dispatched several cars to intercept the truck. As the police waited, they maintained contact with Watson and the trucking company, keeping tabs on the truck's whereabouts at all times. They knew just when to expect it. When the truck came barreling down the highway, the driver saw the roadblock ahead. He tried to escape, but the police sprang into action. Once the truck was halted, the police moved in. Hiding inside was Troy Armstrong. He was arrested for the murder of Belinda Tillery. By now, evidence against him had mounted. A former girlfriend and others admitted that he had confessed to killing Tillery. On December 5th, 1996, Armstrong was convicted for murder and sentenced to life in prison. Karen Taylor's lifelike reconstruction of Belinda K. Tillery was the key to solving a difficult case. Without it, the victim would never have been identified, and the killer never brought to justice. Like the artist she was trained to be, Taylor relies on pen and paper to capture likenesses. Elsewhere, scientists are beginning to apply digital technology to achieve a similar goal. At Colorado State University in Fort Collins, they're developing equipment to match faces to skulls with laser beam accuracy. Mechanical engineering professor Patrick Fitzhorn and a graduate student combined computer-aided design with laser technology. They created a system that scans three-dimensional objects and reconstructs them in a computer.
So what this machine can do is build a three-dimensional surface mesh, computer surface mesh, of a human skull that we can then play with on the computer. We can scale it up and down, we can move it through space.
As the skull rotates slowly on the platter, a laser beam strikes it at 10,000 to 50,000 points. A sensor measures the distance the beam travels as it reflects off each point. The results are fed into a computer that creates a digital version of the skull. The image is virtual, but its application is real.
And obviously what we want to do with it then at that point is to fix it in space, to take a scanned facial photograph and to map the photograph on the skull to see whether there's a match or not.
A photograph of the would-be owner of the skull is also scanned. The digital photo can be cleaned up and sharpened. Here, Fitzhorn made the photograph semi-transparent so he could superimpose it over the skull. Now he can compare their features.
But here you can see the teeth in here. There's the bridge of the nose. Here are the eyes. There's the eyeball in its orb. There's the other eyeball in its orb. There's the end of the cheekbone here. The jaw line down in here.
Currently, a forensic artist relies on his best guess to determine whether a photograph matches a skull. He takes measurements and superimposes a photograph over a skull. But if the picture was taken from an odd angle, it could distort the results.
The mouth doesn't match up. And now what we're seeing is how the skull is oriented. You can see how it's rotated in here with respect to the photograph. So here, this is the plane that the photograph is in, and you can see the skewing of the skull with respect to it. Again, trying to line the skull up in orientation with respect to the way the face was oriented when the camera photograph was taken.
Fitzhorn can rotate the skull and reorient the scanned facial photograph to minimize the distortion. Some photos aren't clear enough or are too distorted to enhance, defying efforts to make a match that's 100% certain. But Fitzhorn is convinced that his method is much more precise, less subjective than previous methods.
But one of the things that I'm really excited about is the potential to take 4 or 5 points on the skull, to take 4 or 5 matching points on the face, and actually attempt to compute whether or not there's a match. What we'd like to be able to do is numerically compute this fit on the computer and then be able to say something like this is a 95% probability of match, or this is a 35% probability of match.
As Patrick Fitzhorn and his colleagues perfect their computer face matching system, forensic artists in Louisiana are on a different mission. Instead of applying digital technology to identify the dead, they're hoping to use it to find the living. In this case, a girl who's been missing for over 20 years. In 1976, in a small town in Louisiana, a family argument turned sour. It wasn't the first time Geneva Martin and her teenage daughter argued. But what started out as a typical mother-daughter conflict soon turned into a 21-year ordeal for Geneva Martin.
She was 16 years old, you know. She let her opinion be known, and I let my opinion be known, and she wasn't any more wrong than I was.
The argument ended as many before. The two went back to their chores without saying a word to each other. Then Donna decided to leave.
Bye, Mom.
She said she was going to her grandmother's house. It was 2:30 p.m. By 5, she hadn't returned, so her concerned mother went looking for her at her grandmother's. But Donna wasn't there. Her grandmother said Donna had gone next door to play cards with her Aunt Peggy.
Well, didn't think anything about it, went back home. When she wasn't home at 9 o'clock, we went to Peggy's, and there was no Donna.
Donna Martin had run away from home before, but this time it seemed like she wasn't coming back. Despite many attempts to find her, almost a year passed before Geneva Martin heard any news of her daughter. Then, one of Donna's friends told Geneva she had picked up Donna on the road and given her a ride to an apartment she was sharing in Baton Rouge. Geneva, desperately wanting to patch things up with her daughter, went to find her. But when she got there, the apartment was vacant. All that remained was Donna's name on the mailbox. The manager confirmed that Donna had been living there.
Excuse me, I took a picture of Donna to her, and she told me, yes, this was the young girl that had lived in the apartment with another married couple. From there, we found nothing.
Despite all she did to find her daughter, the trail remained cold for more than 20 years. Today, Geneva Martin hopes researchers at Louisiana State University will help heat it up again. Forensic anthropologist Mary Manheim and forensic artist Eileen Barrow use computers to simulate the aging process. If they can produce an accurate likeness of Donna Martin today at age 37, her mother may have a chance of finding her. LSU's Forensic Anthropology and Computer Enhancement Services, or FACES, is an ambitious program that's collecting data on the subtleties of the human face. Among its objectives, to develop precise standards of measurement for tissue thickness on the human skull. The information is used by forensic artists trying to build faces from bare bones. Until now, they relied on measurements based on cadavers. Manheim believes that using live subjects will produce much more accurate measurements. By using living models, Manheim can select from a much broader and more complete statistical range. Though subjects remain anonymous, their age, sex, race, height, weight, and other personal information becomes part of the computer's database. To measure tissue thickness, she uses an ultrasound scanner, like the ones used to show a fetus in the womb. The scanner bounces sound waves off the skull. By measuring the time it takes for waves to return, a computer calculates the exact depth of the tissue from skin to bone. The process is repeated at 19 points across the skull.
We've scanned over 400, almost 500 people now, and those range in age from 2 years of age to approximately 74 years of age. There are many different sizes, many different racial groups, so we will separate these out, height, weight, age, etc., and we will produce standards.
Manheim has scanned the faces of generations of the same family. The data will show how family resemblances change over time. Manheim and her colleagues are also using computers to show what a missing child's face might look like as it grows older. With young children, the first step is stretching the child's features to reflect growth of the skull. In this case, a 5-year-old child disappeared and has been missing 5 years. Barrow renders the child at age 10. The computer's stretching tool divides the face into a grid.
And you pull each intersection of that grid down just a few steps. All right, so then that's the stretch. When we age a child, of course, the first thing we need is a picture of the child and a picture of her father and mother, or a sibling, or whoever the parent or the sibling might be that she looks most like.
The face can now be merged with the faces of her immediate family to create a composite image. With the click of a mouse, Barrow brings the missing child's features to the front.
To retain her particular look, the eyes and eyebrows, we would bring back a little bit of the shape of her nose and a little bit of the shape of her mouth. And then we would bring back or bring to the foreground her father's teeth, since she is, in this particular picture, the child had been missing for 5 years. So we were progressing her from 5 years old to about 10. So by that time, her teeth would have, of course, baby teeth would be gone and she would have permanent teeth, so we used the father's teeth to put in the picture.
The computer makes the manipulations easily. but Barrow must rely on her own judgment to decide which features to alter. Will the child look like a parent or more like her sibling? It's a question she'll need to answer when aging Donna Martin. Creating an image of what she might look like today will pose an extraordinary challenge. She'll have to be aged 21 years. Donna's face won't be stretched because at age 16 her face was fully developed.
All right.
Barrow will concentrate on other techniques. First, photographs of family members close to the age Donna would be today are scanned into the computer. Because family members tend to age alike, this will help guide Barrow as she makes decisions about aging Donna. By studying the photographs, Barrow can begin to see at what stage the relatives begin to show crow's feet or lines around the mouth, and how severe they might be. She can also see when chins begin to droop or when necks begin to sag.
She really did not look very much at all like her sisters, which I expected that she would. And she really didn't have a lot of resemblance to her mother. So we had no pictures of her father at that age, so I decided that the best thing to do would be to try to merge her with her mother.
To merge the image of Donna Martin at 16 with her mother at age 40, Barrow must first align and resize the photographs. The photograph of Donna is a 3/4 view. To align it with her mother's, Barrow must adjust it to show a frontal view.
Now what happens here is that the mother's picture is quite a bit bigger than hers. So then what I have to do is size the picture of the mother. And that means reducing its size to try to fit the other one.
Barrow patiently and meticulously merges the photographs. She makes sure Donna's features remain dominant, while taking some physical cues from her mother's image. Then she erases Donna's hairstyle at age 16, so a more mature style can be added. Finally, the transformation is complete. The 16-year-old Donna Martin has become a woman of 37.
Well, it looks a lot like our family. Oddly enough, it looks like my husband's family rather than myself.
Geneva Martin will distribute the image of Donna nationwide. She hopes it will finally reunite her with her daughter and put to rest that fateful argument that's gone unresolved for 21 years. The work of one forensic artist may lead a daughter back to her mother. In one of forensic art's most acclaimed cases, another artist used his skills to lead police to a killer. In 1971, the quiet surface of a prosperous community was shattered by a brutal crime. A successful accountant, John Emil List, lived with his family in a mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. Then his fortunes waned. So in November of 1971, List began a new life. But first, he had to end his current one. He killed his entire family, his wife, 3 children, and his elderly mother. Then he dragged the bodies into the ballroom and arranged them neatly in a row. He tried to clean as much of their blood off the floor as he could. He also sat down to write a long letter of confession. When he finished, he left his house for the last time. A month passed before the Westfield police received a call from a woman concerned about her neighbors. She hadn't seen them home, and their lights had been on day and night until one by one they'd burned out.
I'm back either. I think we're going to have to make entry.
When the police arrived, they found an unattended mansion in need of repair. They looked around the outside of the house until they found an open window. When they entered, they had no idea what was waiting for them. The air was cold and filled with the odor of decay. They kept searching through the darkness until they finally came upon the List family in the ballroom, still neatly laid out, dead for a month. It was one of the most grotesque murders Westfield police had ever seen. When detectives were called in, they found the guns List had used and his letter of confession. List was an active member in the church and addressed the letter to his pastor. In it, he explained that he was no longer able to support his family and pay for the mansion his wife had insisted they buy. He was worried his family faced a life of humiliation on welfare. He was also upset his wife and children had stopped attending church. He felt his daughter had taken a misguided interest in acting, which threatened to deny her status as one of God's children. At least, he concluded, I'm certain they've all gone to heaven now. After slaying his family, List left his car at New York's Kennedy Airport and took a bus heading out of town. He hid his crime carefully. A month passed before anyone noticed his disappearance. Police and the FBI conducted a worldwide search, but nothing turned up. 18 years later, New Jersey detective Bernard Tracy was still on the case. He would make one last effort to find John Emil List by turning to the experts who combine art and science to age the human face. An accurate portrait of John List as a middle-aged man might alert someone somewhere to turn him in.
One thing I can tell you about the John List investigation, back in 1971, this was a state-of-the-art investigation.
Tracy was assigned to the case in 1974, taking over from detectives who'd been on the case for 3 years. The investigation was one of the most thorough ever conducted by New Jersey police. In their search for clues, detectives performed psychological profiles of List and his family.
We did little profiles on the victims. That was John List, his oldest son. His son Frederick, who was 13 at the time. And his daughter Patricia was 16.
Though the case had cooled by 1974, Tracy was convinced John List was still alive.
The common case is that when a person kills people close to them, they kill themselves shortly thereafter. If he wasn't found shortly thereafter dead, a victim of suicide, then I believed he would still be alive. It was just a question of where.
In an effort to find out, Tracy persuaded a television producer to include the case in a series on fugitives from justice. The producer, in turn, enlisted the expertise of Philadelphia forensic artist Frank Bender to sculpt the face of List as he might appear at age 63. The sculpture would appear on television for millions of people to see. If Bender could produce a good likeness of John List 18 years after the crime, he might finally be found. To help guide his imagination as he adds years to a face, Bender carefully reviews the subject's background and his habits, knowing they're unlikely to change. Behavior can influence how a person ages. Before starting the List project, Bender thoroughly researched his subject. He discussed List's psychological aspects with forensic psychologists and police experts.
If you mow your lawn in a suit and tie, you're not relaxed. It's about staying in control. He'll still be wearing probably the same clothes, the same type of bow tie. None of that's going to change.
You know, I've been going to a church on Sundays, and as often as I can, to try to get the feel of like what his environment is really like.
Any clue police gave him about List's life helped Bender form an image of how he may have aged.
Lifestyle, hairstyle, hobbies, hereditary factors. Then I either do my own psychological profile, as I've done in numerous cases, or as in this case, bring in a forensic psychologist and go back and forth with this individual, walk around the town for maybe 2 or 3 days, really get to know this person, put my feet in their shoes, and in a sense kind of become the person so I can stay one step ahead of them visually.
To obtain a scientific outlook on the aging process, Bender visited the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania. Here he consulted with Dr. Scott Bartlett, an expert in cranial and facial surgery and in repairing congenital deformities of the face. Dr. Bartlett's knowledge of the aging process, as reflected in the human face, made him a valuable ally. Bender was curious about the appearance of a scar behind List's ear from an operation.
The scar went from his ear down to at least his collar.
I would guess that, you know, drawing the ear in something like this, more to the side of the head, and I would guess that there's bound to be, if he had an open mastoid operation, that he might have a fairly significant scar back here.
Dr. Bartlett pointed out that as List aged, wrinkles and folds in his neck could make the scar less noticeable.
I see, okay.
The two men also discussed how aging affects the eyelids and brows, which can change significantly over 18 years.
The canthal attachment here, which is the outer and the inner corners of the eye, I don't think change a lot. I think what we're seeing here is this hooding, this laxity of the soft tissue that's now falling over and giving this a downward slant, down and outward slant to the eye opening here, as opposed to this fresh up and out slant that you see in youth.
Ultimately, Frank Bender would apply his own intuition to what he learned about the case. Bender has been a sculptor for more than 30 years, showing his work in galleries and museums all over the United States.
Most of my studies are human behavior. I'm a people person. When I go to the beach, I don't look at the ocean as much as I like studying the people on the beach, how they interact, what they look like, the differences, what makes each person an individual.
Beginning his sculpture of John List, Bender had a problem. He had to construct a three-dimensional model, yet the only available photograph of List was a frontal view. There were no pictures showing a three-quarter or side view. Bender would rely on his experience as a commercial photographer to study the photograph and analyze its three dimensions based on highlight and shadow.
Now, with fugitives, you have old photographs. The most important thing with a fugitive, I found, is to stay within the perimeters of the skull. The same as facial reconstruction. This is where the similarities lie. If you elongate the head, you theoretically are changing the shape of the skull, the foundation underneath.
As he worked on his sculpture, he checked his work with acetate overlays made from the 20-year-old photograph.
I take an old photograph, enlarge it to what I feel would be life-size, do acetate overlays, and then lie it over the sculpture as I'm working on it to make sure that I'm within the perimeters of the skull.
As a face began to emerge from clay, Bender delved ever deeper into the mind of John List.
I felt that John List wanted to kind of be and in a sense a generic individual. You know, wanted to blend in, didn't want to create waves. Wanted some peace in his life, which he never got from his wife. And this started building up his anxiety. I really believe he tried to get this through the church and was getting it. But when he came back home, it was complete overload.
Once the preliminary sculpture was complete, Bender and his assistant made a plaster cast.
That's good.
Little by little, Bender's sculpture took shape. By now, Bender was more familiar with List's face than with his own. As the bust of the fugitive emerged from its mold, Frank Bender was ready to add the final details to the face of a killer. John Emil List, after murdering his family, had evaded capture for 18 years. Whether police could find him would depend on Frank Bender's intuitive ability to imagine John List in his early 60s. Bender guessed that List's hairline continued to recede, as it had begun to do in his earlier photograph. He added jowls based on his assessment of List's lifestyle.
He wasn't an exercise type person. He was a potato and meat type person. As far as the eyes, you know, you can see where he's starting to get some lines. I look a little tired. You see, I sculpted the tie and the shirt and the coat, you know, the suit coat on him, because he's always going to be wearing that.
Bender sensed that the years of hiding what he had done would take a toll on List. This influenced his decision to turn the corners of his mouth down.
You can see the corners of the mouth going down here rather than up like the photograph, which I'll bring right over. And you can see how they turned up. After 20 years, I'm having them go down. Not his whole mouth going down, just the corners. Again, not only aging, but the fear of getting caught.
As a final touch, Bender selected eyeglasses for the aged List. He searched for a style that would define a man who killed his entire family, yet called himself a Christian. He decided on thick black frames, thinking List might go for an austere, authoritative look that would discourage others from prying into his past. Now his sculpture was ready for the nation to see. On May 21st, 1989, millions of people across the United States saw Frank Bender's sculpture of John Emil List. Was the likeness good enough to catch the killer?
Oh my God, that's Bob Clark.
Ricky!
Yeah? Is that Mr. Clark? Yeah, it looks like
One of the viewers was a woman from Denver, Colorado. When she saw the bust, she called in. She said it looked just like her former neighbor, Robert P. Clark, who moved to Virginia.
Good morning. We're with the FBI.
Yes, can you direct us to the office of Robert Clark, please?
Yes, Mr. Clark's office is down.
Following up on the tip, FBI agents found a man who called himself Robert Clark at an office in Richmond, Virginia. After years of getting away with a horrible murder, List was about to see his last days as a free man. When the agents approached him, he insisted he was not John List. But on his neck was the telltale scar, and his fingerprints matched those of the killer. With that, the agents had proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Robert P. Clark and John Emil List were in fact the same man. Since the murders, John List had remarried and recreated his life as an accountant, confident that the crimes he'd committed in 1971 would never come back to haunt him. For Detective Bernard Tracy, it was the end of an incredible odyssey. A cold-blooded murderer finally captured after 18 years. By all accounts, the resemblance between the bust created by Frank Bender and the actual John List was uncanny.
I think the bust was something that if a person looked at that and had any doubt that that would be the straw that broke the camel's back, that would be the one. If they had any hesitation about calling, and then they saw the bust, that would be the one that would take them over the edge and say, I got a call. This is him.
John Emil List was convicted of murdering his family and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. He and his unsuspecting new wife were attending a church function on the night Frank Bender's sculpture aired nationwide. As a result, they missed the show that gave John List yet another new start in life in New Jersey's State Penitentiary. Armed with photographs, scientific data, psychological profiles, and artistic talent, forensic artists breathe new life into unsolved cases. Using their unique knowledge of human physiology and human nature, they can help locate the missing, track murderers through time, and bring killers to justice.